Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. Billings, himself a veteran of the war, offers detailed descriptions of camp life, hardships, food, equipment, and the camaraderie shared among soldiers. This version has been adapted to suit the modern listener, ensuring its timeless stories and insights remain accessible and engaging today. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. The camp of a regiment or battery was theoretically laid out according to the detailed guidelines of Army regulations. These rules specified that each company of a regiment should arrange its tents in 2 rows, creating a street that intersected the regimental color line at a right angle. This color line served as the designated space for regimental formations. Behind each company's tents were those of the company officers, and further back were the tents of the field officers. Cavalry units followed a similar layout, though with a single row of tents per company, while artillery units used 3 rows of tents, 1 for each section. Despite these regulations, the reality of camp life often diverged significantly from the prescribed order. Army regulations were designed for the regular standing army, which was a small fraction of the Union forces during the Civil War. The majority of troops were volunteers who often ignored or resisted strict adherence to these rules. In some regiments commanded by strict disciplinarians, camps were organized neatly and closely followed regulations. However, in many cases, the layout was far more informal, resembling a chaotic do-as-you-please approach. In wooded areas, where winter cantonments were typically set up, the layout of camps was frequently adjusted to accommodate the terrain and trees. Now, let us step inside one of the log huts. These shelters often varied in design, but I have already described the common features: the walls, roof, chimney, and fireplace. The door could be located at the same end as the fireplace, particularly in smaller huts where space was limited. More commonly, however, the door was placed at the center of one side, with the fireplace located on the opposite wall. Inside, bunks were typically arranged against the walls. In huts occupied by 2 men, there was often just 1 bunk. In huts shared by 4 or more men, there were usually 2 bunks, one near the ground and another higher up the wall. Occasionally, there would only be 1 long bunk running the length of the hut. The construction of these bunks varied. Some were made from wooden boards scavenged from hardtack boxes, while others were fashioned from barrel staves laid across 2 poles. Resourceful soldiers sometimes created spring beds using slender saplings, which they padded with hay, pine needles, or oak leaves. Others improvised hammocks from coarse grain sacks, often borrowed from cavalry or artillery camps. Each bunk had a designated area where soldiers stored their belongings: knapsacks or bundles that contained underclothes, socks, needles, thread, buttons, letters, photographs, and other personal items. Infantry soldiers typically carried fewer possessions than artillerymen, who could store their gear on gun carriages or caisson during marches. In winter quarters, soldiers often accumulated additional comforts sent from home in boxes, which became a cherished source of joy. Canteens, haversacks, and other equipment were usually hung on pegs driven into the walls, while muskets were either propped in corners or hung by their slings. Even in these rudimentary shelters, some soldiers managed to create conveniences. A hardtack box nailed upright to a wall, fitted with shelves and a door made of leather hinges, served as a dish cupboard. Another box turned upside down on makeshift legs became a small but functional table. Shelves above the fireplace were sometimes added to hold miscellaneous items, and crude 3- or 4-legged stools were crafted for seating. Huts with these features were considered luxurious, though many were far more basic and lacked such conveniences. A soldier's tableware typically consisted of a tin dipper, a tin plate, and a knife, fork, and spoon. After meals, plates were often thrown under the bunk until the next use. When cleaning was attempted, it was minimal and improvised. Soldiers might scrape plates with a knife, wipe them with straw or leaves, or even use a piece of soft bread as a dishcloth. Occasionally, hot coffee was poured into a plate to rinse it clean. Utensils, when they became too blackened to use, were cleaned by being vigorously driven into the ground multiple times, a surprisingly effective method. Lighting inside the huts was provided by government-issued candles, though their availability varied. Initially, long candles were distributed and had to be cut into smaller portions for each soldier. Later, shorter candles were supplied. Sometimes these candles were plentiful, other times, they were scarce, leading to complaints. Quartermasters were often blamed for shortages, though not always justly. Some soldiers simply used more candles than others, while a few seemed perpetually short of supplies, as if they were incapable of managing rations for the intended period. These log huts, though crude, became homes during the harsh winter months. The soldiers' creativity and resourcefulness in crafting and furnishing them brought a sense of normalcy to an otherwise harsh and uncertain life. For many, these humble shelters were a place of camaraderie, providing both physical and emotional comfort during their time in camp. The government provided candlesticks to the troops by the thousands. These were made of steel, durable, and primarily supplied to the infantry. For them, the process was simple. They would unfix their bayonets, stick the points into the ground, and voila, instant candlesticks. In fact, the bayonet shank became the standard candlestick for the rank and file, as it was always available and served the purpose well. Potatoes, though occasionally used as makeshift holders, were generally too valuable as food to be sacrificed for this. Often, candles were simply set upright on a box, held in place by their own drippings. When candles ran out, soldiers made do with slush lamps. These were crafted by filling sardine boxes with cookhouse grease and inserting a piece of rag in one corner to act as a wick. The entire lamp would then be hung from the hut's ridge pole using wire, often salvaged from bales of hay brought for horses and mules. The bunks in the huts were highly valued by the soldiers. At times, soldiering could be a lazy life, and the bunks served not just as beds but as substitutes for ottomans, lounges, and easy chairs, luxuries that a soldier's standard kit did not include. They became central to camp life, especially during moments of rest or leisure. Each soldier was issued a woolen blanket and a rubber blanket. When retiring for the night after the tattoo roll call, soldiers didn't undress fully as they might at home. Typically, they removed only their coats, boots, and sometimes their vests. Some stripped down to their flannels, donned a smoking cap, and slept quite comfortably. However, a few soldiers never removed their uniforms, day or night, unless absolutely necessary, and would sleep fully dressed, wrapped in every bit of covering they could find. These men were a minority and will be discussed further in another context. Sharing bunks in winter quarters had a distinct advantage: the warmth of shared blankets. Soldiers often laid the rubber blanket as a bottom sheet, with the line side up. This arrangement, used both in huts and on open ground, helped insulate against cold air and retain body heat. The half shelters used as roofs were not entirely waterproof in heavy rain. During storms, soldiers in the upper bunks would often use their rubber blankets or ponchos to cover the roof above them. If they didn't want to venture outside to adjust these, they sometimes spread them inside as an additional layer of protection. When feeling particularly lethargic, they would simply drape the blankets over themselves and let the water run onto the floor. Occasionally, inspectors of government property would visit to assess the condition of military supplies. Items deemed unfit for further use were stamped with IC, inspected and condemned. Soldiers adopted this designation humorously, using it to label other items or situations they found lacking. During the day, soldiers spent much of their time in their bunks. They slept, read, or sat on them to write letters. Visitors often perched on the bunks unless stools or boxes were available for seating. However, some soldiers were strict about who could sit on their beds, especially if they prided themselves on cleanliness. The limited seating often led to quick maneuvering to claim spots on the bunks, reflecting both necessity and a sense of etiquette. This brings us to one of the most persistent challenges soldiers faced: the infamous pediculus vestimentae, the dreaded grayback lice. These pests were an unavoidable nuisance for both Union and Confederate soldiers. Like death, they spared no one, preying on all ranks equally, from privates to major generals. It was common for soldiers to recount horrific infestations. One orderly reported picking 52 lice off an officer's shirt in a single sitting. No level of hygiene or vigilance could entirely prevent these pests. When a soldier first discovered lice on his person, he often kept it a secret, hoping it was an isolated incident. However, this hope was usually short-lived. The initial lone louse was often the vanguard of a larger infestation, and within days, soldiers were forced to conduct thorough inspections of their garments. This process, referred to as skirmishing, involved painstakingly checking every fiber of their clothing, often in private at first. Over time, the shame associated with lice faded, and skirmishing became a more open, accepted activity. In fact, maintaining this habit was seen as a mark of cleanliness. In cooler weather, skirmishing was typically done indoors, but during warmer months, soldiers preferred to carry out this grim task in the woods near camp. It was common to see men sitting alone or in small groups, meticulously inspecting their garments and killing lice. Occasionally, a soldier would procure a new uniform from the quartermaster, burn his old infested clothing, and begin anew. However, within a week, the lice often found their way back. Hot water was the most effective remedy for lice infestations. Boiling garments killed both the lice and their eggs, although some veterans swore the pests could survive even boiling water unless salt was added. The effort required to manage these infestations led to a universal sentiment among soldiers that the country was suffering from an overproduction of lice. They joked that a device to exterminate lice as effectively as Paris green killed potato beetles would make its inventor rich and famous. Aside from lice, no other insect caused significant annoyance to soldiers. Occasionally, a wood tick would burrow into the skin, but these were relatively rare and not considered unclean. The lice, however, were a constant companion, ensuring that no soldier ever fully escaped their irritating presence. It's no wonder, then, that soldiers were protective of their bunks, preferring not to share them with others, even their comrades. I have already mentioned how soldiers passed the time, but two additional domestic tasks, washing and mending, also occupied their attention in the log huts. For some, these chores were essential and performed with regularity, while others avoided them as much as possible. Some men insisted on changing their underclothing at least once a week, maintaining a level of cleanliness similar to their habits at home. On the other hand, there were those who only did so under extreme necessity. It is still unpleasant to recall how little care many soldiers took regarding personal hygiene. The old story about a soldier who, after finally bathing, discovered a stash of shirts and socks he thought were lost might seem like an exaggeration, but it reflects the shocking lack of cleanliness among a minority of the troops. Washing clothes was a challenge. If a camp was near a brook, it made things somewhat easier, but clothes still needed to be boiled. For this, the mess kettles were the only available option. These kettles were used for boiling meat, potatoes, bean soup, pea soup, tea, coffee, and even for making apple and peach sauce. So why not use them for boiling clothes as well? Though it might seem unappetizing at first, soldiers quickly adapted to the situation. Necessity overruled propriety, and such improvised uses became routine. Soldiers could not afford luxuries like dedicated wash boilers or well-equipped laundries, so double or even triple use of basic items was standard. Not every soldier did his own washing. In most companies, at least one man offered laundry services for a modest fee and was kept busy with as much work as he could handle during his off-duty hours. Ironing, however, was non-existent, as white shirts with stiff collars, often referred to as boiled shirts, were nearly unheard of in the field, except in hospitals. Flannel shirts were the norm. White collars, when worn, were made of paper, and white cuffs were entirely absent from camp life. When it came to mending garments, soldiers had to rely on themselves. Each man carried a housewife, a small sewing kit containing needles, thread, buttons, and other essentials, often provided by a mother, sister, sweetheart, or a soldier's aid society. Despite this, many soldiers had little interest in tasks like sock darning. They often delayed repairs until their socks were in tatters, with heels worn out and toes peeking through. Some men resorted to tying a string around holes to avoid darning altogether, but such makeshift solutions were rarely comfortable. Others attempted to patch their socks properly, creating a checkerboard of stitches over the holes, though many lacked the patience to complete the job thoroughly. Within hours of being mended, the socks would often tear again. A fortunate few received regular shipments of hand-knit socks from home, made by their grandmothers or other relatives. These well-crafted socks tended to last longer, especially when conscientiously maintained. Government-issued socks, however, were another matter. Made of low-quality materials, they were often misshapen and barely lasted 2 days before developing holes. Soldiers frequently joked that these socks were as open at both ends as a stovepipe. Cooking was another activity that occupied soldiers, though company cooks often took charge of preparing meals in established camps. When rations were distributed raw, soldiers could prepare their food individually, particularly coffee and sugar. Many preferred this arrangement, as they could tailor their coffee to their liking, some preferring it strong, others weak, and some saving sugar for other uses. Soldiers quickly became experts in making coffee to suit their tastes, often finding it more palatable than what company cooks could provide. An interesting point about life in winter quarters was the use of green pine wood for fuel. While northern people might balk at the idea of burning green wood, southern pine, rich in pitch, made it possible. The heartwood, which was comparatively dry, served as kindling, while the pitchy sapwood burned well once the fire was established. Southern pine had the additional advantage of being easier to work with than hardwoods, a feature soldiers greatly appreciated during the harsh winter months. Nearly every military unit had a barber during established camp life. While many soldiers avoided the razor altogether, allowing a wild, unkempt growth of hair and beard to serve as their makeshift camouflage, others carried their own shaving kits and shaved themselves. However, this often resulted in unintended injuries, as the process was neither easy nor painless. For those lacking the skill, tools, or inclination to shave themselves, the camp barber became a preferred choice. The camp barber worked wherever conditions allowed, inside the tent during cold or stormy weather and outside, behind the tent, when the weather permitted. There, he set up an improvised chair for his customers. This chair was a rudimentary creation, built with 4 stakes driven into the ground. 2 longer stakes formed the back legs, and 2 shorter ones made up the front. On this simple framework, a basic structure was constructed to function as a barber's chair, though comfort was far from guaranteed. The barbers themselves varied in skill. Many were far from professional, and a soldier who had his hair cut by one of these barbers might end up with a haircut so uneven it displayed each shingle as clearly as a poorly built roof. Razors, too, were often of questionable quality, resembling the trussed razor of the old song about the Irishman and his love of God shave. These razors could be brutal instruments, dull and difficult to use, adding to the discomfort of the experience. Another common activity in camp, though limited to a few, was the study of military tactics. Some soldiers pursued this under orders from their superior officers, while others did so out of ambition, aiming for promotion. For some, mastering tactics was part of preparing for competitive examinations that could earn them a furlough. These men diligently studied, motivated by their various goals. However, the majority of soldiers, occupied with the relentless practice of war, had little interest in its theory. When off duty, they eagerly sought any form of mental or physical recreation to make the days pass more quickly. Even soldiers facing nearly 3 years of service would, with forced cheerfulness, declare at the end of each long day, "It's only 2 years and a bit." In a previous chapter, I mentioned that Sibley tents could house 12 men. However, this requires some clarification. When all 12 were lying down asleep, the space seemed sufficient. But if one man returned from guard duty at night, particularly the 3rd Relief, posted at midnight and ending at 2 a.m., things often took a chaotic turn. If this guard had to navigate the dark tent to reach his spot, the results could be comically disastrous. If he accidentally stepped on the foot of a sleeping comrade, especially one with a quick temper and a loud voice, a cascade of curses and shouts would immediately ensue. Trying to avoid further mishaps, the guard might attempt to leap over another sleeping body, only to land squarely on the chest of an unsuspecting tentmate. This victim, startled and in pain, would groan loudly before adding his own choice words to the growing clamor. By now, the rest of the tent's occupants, rudely awakened, would join the chorus of complaints. As the noise escalated, nearby tents would inevitably be drawn into the fray. Shouts of "Shut up! Sergeant of the Guard! Go lie down!" or even "Put him in the guardhouse!" would ring out. Eventually, the uproar would wake the sergeant of the guard, who would arrive to investigate. By this time, however, everyone had quieted down, and no one wanted to press charges against their tentmate. The sergeant, unable to identify the culprits, would leave, shaking his head in frustration. Accidents of this kind were often attributed to a specific type of soldier found in every squad, the Jonah. This term referred to someone with an uncanny knack for causing trouble, often unintentionally. The Jonah might, for instance, return to the tent carrying a plate of hot pea soup, only to spill half of it on a comrade's back. If that wasn't enough, he might kick over someone's coffee pot, ruining an entire meal. His sincere and profuse apologies rarely softened the irritation of his tentmates. Cooking mishaps were where the Jonah truly excelled. He was a frequent figure around the campfire, often stirring mysterious concoctions in a tin dipper or tomato can. He'd occasionally sprinkle in ingredients from his pockets, treating his meal like a secret recipe. However, when the fire was already crowded with coffee pots, his clumsiness would reach its peak. turning abruptly to fetch something from his tent, he would trip over the firewood or rails supporting the pots, sending everything tumbling and extinguishing the fire. Such accidents tested the patience of even the calmest soldiers. Coffee and sugar were precious commodities, and their loss was no laughing matter. The resulting outbursts from his tentmates ranged from angry curses to dramatic threats. Those who refrained from yelling often found silent camaraderie with those who didn't. The Jonah's mishaps were so frequent that they became a running joke in camp. Yet, they also served as a reminder of how small frustrations could compound the challenges of military life. One soldier in particular stands out in my memory. Despite being well-meaning and a good soldier overall, he was plagued by a remarkable streak of bad luck. His misfortune culminated in an accident that ended his service. While chopping wood one day, he accidentally swung an axe through his boot and his foot. When he pulled his foot out, he realized he had severed several toes. Calmly tipping the boot upside down, he let the toes fall out as though this were just another routine task. Unfortunately, that injury marked the end of his active duty. There were countless ways in which the Jonah distinguished himself, but for now, let us turn to another notable group within the ranks, the beats, as they were commonly called by their comrades. The term originally referred to men who were lazy or shirked their duties, finding ways to avoid both military and fatigue work. Over time, however, it came to describe a broader range of behavior. One mild form of beat was the man who perpetually sat by the fire in the tent, constantly piling on wood and roasting everyone else out. This man seemed to have no regard for the comfort of his tentmates. He was always cold, wearing an overcoat, dress coat, blouse, and flannels, all at once, but never complained of being too warm. He avoided undressing unless inspections required it and was most comfortable on fatigue duty, where he moved so slowly it seemed he had no intention of finishing the task. Despite their frustrating habits, these men could be found in every regiment, as if their presence was somehow essential to the Union's success. Another, more irritating type of beat was the one who never seemed to have water in his canteen. In camp, where water often required a long walk to fetch, these men conveniently avoided going after it themselves. Instead, they would hang their canteen on a willing comrade heading to the spring. On the march, they were content to lie down and beg a drink from a recruit who didn't yet know their habits. When it came to rations, they always seemed to run out early and relied on their tentmates to lend them food. If hardtack wasn't available, they would borrow coffee, sugar, or even salt pork. Their requests were often accompanied by promises of repayment, backed by tales of overdue letters containing money from home. These beats had an uncanny ability to lose mail. According to their stories, the postal service must have been entirely unreliable, as countless letters containing substantial sums of money never reached them. If their accounts were to be believed, they must not only have sent for all their allotted pay but also borrowed heavily from family and friends. The government attempted to address such issues by introducing an allotment system. Soldiers could designate part of their pay to be sent directly to their families or other recipients. For example, a soldier earning $52 for 4 months of service might allocate $40 to his wife, leaving $12 for himself. This system was a great convenience, as it ensured the money reached its intended destination safely. Despite the allotment system, many beats still claimed they were waiting for additional funds. These promises of repayment were often hollow. While it's true that soldiers forged deep bonds through shared hardships, human nature didn't change in the army. A man who was a beat, thief, or coward before enlisting often remained so. Many borrowed money they had no intention of repaying and were shameless enough to face their creditors without acknowledging their debts. Some even had the audacity to ask for more money years after the war. Another common trick among beats was to delay their guard duty. They would feign sleep, forcing the corporal to wake them multiple times before they sluggishly prepared for their post. Once there, they found ways to avoid standing watch. A favorite excuse was a sudden need to visit the company sink, which conveniently took them away from their post for an extended period. When they returned, they often stalled further, claiming to need medicine or other necessities from their tent. By the time they resumed their post, most of their shift had passed. In this way, they offloaded much of their duty onto the corporal and their comrades. Some beats took deception to extremes. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, one soldier, whose courage had clearly been tested, pretended to suffer from severe rheumatism. He groaned in agony, hobbled painfully, and appeared so unwell that his discharge papers were nearly approved. However, during a move to Kentucky, he overindulged in whiskey, revealing he could walk perfectly well. His discharge was promptly rescinded, and he faced months of well-deserved hardship. Fatigue duty was another area where beats excelled at avoidance. This included tasks like cleaning camp, fetching water, chopping wood, and digging sinks. For those who took their responsibilities seriously, it was frustrating to work alongside beats. These men were quick to complain, claiming they enlisted to fight, not to perform manual labor. Ironically, when a battle loomed, these same men would have gladly agreed to chop every tree in Virginia if it meant avoiding combat. They fit the description of men invincible in peace and invisible in war. While some soldiers lacked the skills for certain tasks, beats actively avoided contributing. Yet the Army was a great educator. Men who had never held an axe or shovel before became proficient through necessity. Over time, even the most unskilled soldiers learned to adapt. The beats, however, were more focused on evading work than improving their abilities, leaving their comrades to carry the burden of their laziness. There were many ways in which a Jonah, with his bad luck and clumsiness, could distinguish himself, but I must turn now to another type of soldier who earned equal notoriety, the beats. This term originally referred to lazy men who shirked their duties, but over time it came to encompass a broader range of characters. One detail, however, seemed to bring out the worst in both the beats and those unskilled in manual labor, handling the spade and pickaxe. It involved administering the last rites to a batch of deceased horses. In the winter months, artillery and cavalry units often lost large numbers of horses. The frozen ground made immediate burial impossible, and by spring, rain, sun, and scavengers, dogs, buzzards, and crows, often left the remains in a particularly unpleasant state. During summer, when the Army paused to rest and regroup, another round of worn-out or diseased horses, especially those infected with glanders, was sacrificed. If these carcasses were not promptly buried, they emitted increasingly pungent odors, forcing the Military Board of Health to order immediate interment. As soon as news spread about this grisly detail, the protests would begin. Soldiers dreaded being chosen for the task, and excuses flowed freely. One man, upon being selected, would claim he had been on guard duty the previous day and was still too exhausted for such a demanding assignment. Another might accuse the sergeant of favoritism, alleging he always gave the easy jobs to his favorites. Despite their protests, the sergeant remained unmoved, and the reluctant soldier would eventually shuffle off, grumbling as he joined the burial squad. Others tried a different tactic. A second man, tipped off about the detail, might feign illness, tucking himself into his bunk and loudly proclaiming his inability to serve. He would call upon his tentmates to vouch for his sudden malady, but they would often remain silent, not wanting to risk being chosen as replacements. Still, unless his excuse was particularly convincing, he would be forced to join the squad. A third soldier might not argue his selection but would insist the process was unfair. "I was on the last horse-burying detail," he might complain, "and I don't see why I should always be the one doing this disgusting work. Surely someone else should get a turn." Yet his objections were rarely heeded, and he, too, would grudgingly head off to the task. Among the chosen was often a high-tempered and profane man. When called for the detail, he would angrily fling aside whatever he was doing, perhaps writing a letter, and stomp out, cursing the government, the war, and his own decision to enlist. His colorful language would fill the air as he vented his frustration, though his fury was not directed at the sergeant directly, knowing such insubordination could not be tolerated. Despite his outbursts, this man was often reliable in battle, standing steadfast at his post without the profanity and temper that marked his camp life. Then there was the recruit, the paper-collar young man straight from the city. He was still adjusting to the rough realities of Army life, wearing his custom-made boots and civilian clothes with a faint air of superiority. When summoned for the burial detail, he would respond without complaint, unwilling to appear weak in front of the seasoned soldiers. His pride prevented him from objecting, though his heart and stomach revolted at the task ahead. Grasping a spade awkwardly, he would join the group, his attempts to hide his discomfort betrayed by his pale, uneasy expression. As the squad marched toward their grim task, they formed a motley procession. Their slow, reluctant steps and solemn faces gave the appearance of a funeral march, though their expressions betrayed dread rather than grief. Upon reaching the burial site, they would begin digging graves beside each carcass to make rolling the bodies easier. But the real drama began once the digging was done. When the time came to roll the carcasses into the graves, the younger recruit was handed an axe to break the protruding legs of a horse that wouldn't fit neatly into the pit. Overwhelmed by the gruesome task and the stench, he turned pale and staggered away, clutching his stomach. His discomfort only added to the amusement of the hardened veterans, who roared with laughter at his expense. Even the officer overseeing the detail, unable to maintain his composure, would often join in the laughter. Despite the unpleasantness of the task, moments like these fostered a strange camaraderie. The officer, the seasoned soldiers, the recruits, and even the beach shared a bond through their shared ordeal, briefly setting aside the ranks and distinctions of military life. These shared experiences created a unique sense of solidarity, uniting them in ways that few other experiences could. That concludes the third part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.